In today's tutorial, I'm going to be showing you my ultimate guide to how to top coat and flood coat any resin piece, no matter what shape it is. In this tutorial, I'm going to be working with a few different pieces that I have. This one here, you can see it's really curved and it's also got a matte finish to it due to the silicone mold. I've also got a ring cone that when it did come out of the mold, because it was an older mold, it has left imperfections and marks on the surface. So I obviously need to fix that, and the way I'm going to do that is by doing a top coat or a flood coat. Now I have purposely picked these pieces for this tutorial to show you that no matter what shape you're working with, you can top coat and flood coat it. For ages when I first started working with resin, I thought you could only do that if the piece was completely flat and you could only do the top surface area. But if you prepare your pieces correctly, it doesn't matter what shape they are, you will be able to top coat them. To do this, you're going to need to sand back your pieces. Now, because you are sanding back resin, it is absolutely essential you wear your safety gear. So that is a proper mask and goggles to protect your eyes, or a full face respirator is really handy. I also do use my orbital sander as well as hand sanding depending on the shape of my item. So for this first item, because it is so curved, using an orbital sander is not the best option, as it is designed to sand flat surfaces, and it is so strong and powerful that if you did try to use it around the curves, you would find it would just end up sanding those areas completely flat, and you lose that beautiful shape of the item. So for curved pieces like this, I would recommend either using a Dremel or just doing what I'm doing and hand sanding it. The reason why you sand back a piece before doing the final coat of resin is the sandpaper will roughen up the surface of the resin, which then allows the next layer of the resin to adhere really well and grip to it. Now, there are two major key factors that really affect how your resin will grip to your piece, and you'll have issues down the track if you don't do them properly when it does come to doing the resin layer. Now, the first key factor is choosing the right grit of sandpaper when you are sanding your pieces back. If you pick a grit that is too rough, it will leave too much of a sand mark on your piece, which you can sometimes see when you do go to top coat, because it will damage the piece a little bit too much. And if you use a grit that's too fine, so anything above a 400 grit, what you'll find is it won't be gritty enough and your resin won't adhere to it as well. So choosing the correct grit will make a massive difference. Now, personally, I like to pick a 200 to 240, I find is the most ideal grit of sandpaper to use. It's rough enough that it will let the resin attach and adhere to the whole piece no matter what shape it is, but it's also not too rough where I'm going to be damaging my piece and end up with big sand marks going through my piece. Like you can see here where I did use an 80 grit to sand back this side, and now I do have quite big lines going through it, where the other side I used a 200 grit and I don't have any of that damage from the sandpaper. Now on this piece, I am using my deburring tool before I do sand it with my orbital sander, and the reason behind that is a lot of the time when you do pour resin and as it sets, it will naturally contract and it will leave a little lip to it, and then when you put your orbital sander over the top, it won't sand evenly because you'll have an uneven surface. So by just removing that little edge to your piece will mean it will be a lot easier to use your orbital sander over the top. Now, if you are doing just a top coat where you're only going to be doing the top surface area, this isn't as important to do. But if you are going to be doing a flood coat like I am going to be doing on this piece, by taking off those really sharp edges, it means that the resin will be able to pour over that edge because it will have a curve to it instead of a really sharp line. All the pieces have been sanded back, and this is what you should look for. You don't want to see any of that glossy resin surface to it. You want to have it all completely sanded everywhere that you want the resin to go. So for these pieces, I'm going to be flood coating them, which is basically where you pour the resin and it will go over the edges, therefore flooding that surface area. And then I'm also going to show you a top coat as well. Now, they are all covered in that sanding dust, so I need to give them a really good clean before I do my flood coating, because I don't want that to still be on my items when I do so. So this is just some water, and I'm using a toothbrush just to give them a really good scrub. If you've got a scrubbing brush or anything else, just to remove any of that sand dust or anything that might have gotten in while you were sanding. It's really important to give them a really thorough clean before you do top coat or flood coat them. Once the pieces have been cleaned, I do just let them air dry naturally, just so that way all of that water will evaporate before I do my resin coats, because obviously I don't want to have any moisture on my pieces before I pour the resin. So I normally do this the day before and then come back the next day to do all of the resin coating. To prevent any resin drips from forming on the bottom of my pieces, I'm going to protect the bottom area by using some PVA glue or latex. Now both of these work exactly the same, and all I'm doing is applying a really good amount of PVA glue onto my first item, and then onto my second piece I'm going to be applying latex. Now they're completely the same method. You need to make sure that you have a good layer. If you do this too thin, the resin will still be able to grip to the piece, so you need to make sure it's decently thick. Now both of these do dry quite slow when they are thick, so normally I do have to wait a good few hours for them to dry before I can start coating my pieces. Something else that's really important if you are going to use either one of these methods to protect the bottom from resin drips is take your time when applying it and make sure you get it right up to the edge. If you don't get it as close to the edge, then you'll obviously get resin going in where the latex or the PVA glue isn't. And it goes the other way, that if you get the PVA glue on an area that you don't want, then obviously the resin will not stick to that area. So this is why it's really important to take your time and just gently get it right up to the edge of exactly where you want the resin and the bottom of your piece to meet. And this is what both look like when they have dried, and now I am ready to do a flood coat on both of these pieces. Now, if you are just looking to top coat a piece, you do not need to completely sand it the whole way around. You only need to sand the surface area that you want to top coat. So for this piece, to protect the edges, I'm just going to be using some painter's tape. I once again could do the same technique I did for the previous two pieces, where I could apply either a liquid latex or a PVA glue around the edges, but because this is just top coating and the piece is a pretty simple piece to wrap tape around, I'm just going to use some painter's tape. And I like to go around twice. I get it right up to the edge of where I am obviously going to be top coating, and I go around twice just to make sure that none of that resin can basically sink through the tape and then attach itself on to the side of my piece. And I also like to make sure I just leave a lip at the bottom, so that way when it does drip down, it goes off the edge. Now that all my pieces are prepped correctly, it is time to move on to resin. Now, picking the right resin and using it in the correct way is going to make such a big difference. Now, I'm using a top coating resin, and this one is from Icoat Epoxy, and it is really important that you pick a top coating resin when you're doing any finishing coats to a piece. And there's a few reasons why. They are designed to have a really good UV resistance. They're also generally quite a tougher version of an epoxy resin, so you're going to get less scratches or any sort of damage to your piece. And they are also generally made to be quite thick and grip really well to a surface area, which is obviously what we want, especially if you're doing any shapes that are curved, because you want that resin to be able to grip really well and be quite thick. If you were trying to top coat with, say, a casting resin that's designed to be a lot more fluid, you'll find that it will just pour off the edges and not curve around or grip properly, and you'll get gaps in the resin and you'll really struggle to top coat or flood coat any sort of pieces. I also have just prepared my resin by getting it to the correct temperature in a warm water bath, because it is winter here at the moment, and when it is colder your resin will be thicker, which will then be a little bit harder to work with, a little bit harder to mix. So by putting it in a warm water bath to get it to the correct temperature, it means that it's going to work a lot better. Now, this resin that I am working with is a 1-to-1 ratio, so 1 part resin to 1 part hardener, and then you just need to make sure that you mix it really well. So scrape all the edges and the bottom, and I also will transfer it into a new cup and then mix it up again, because the last thing you want is to not have properly mixed resin and then have a piece that won't ever fully set or cure properly because you didn't mix the resin correctly in the first place when you are doing your final coat. For this first piece, I'm going to be doing a full flood coat. I've got 2 cups down just to prop my piece up, so that way it's not sitting directly on the table, and that way the resin can just pour off the edge. I'm also just going to be making sure that it is nice and level before I do start pouring my resin, because that will make a big difference with getting the resin nice and even the whole way around. So take your time with this. Because coating resins are designed to grip, they will generally be quite thick, and when resins are thicker you will find that they will have a lot more bubbles, because when you mix them up they're just going to naturally get quite bubbly. But you don't need to worry about that, because you can use some heat to pop those bubbles out of the resin, but you want to be able to work fast. A lot of top coat resins will have a really short working time, so if you take a lot of time once you have mixed up your resin to prep everything, you'll find that it will be a real struggle to get those bubbles out, because it will be too late by then to start trying to pop them. So whenever I mix up my top coat resin, I am always ready to work pretty much straight away, so that way I can get the maximum amount of time for all of those bubbles to release out before the resin does start to cure. To help spread out the resin over the whole surface area of my piece, I'm just using my paddle pop stick to do so, and making sure that every area is getting fully covered with that resin. You don't want to have a gap, because sometimes the resin won't fill that in. You can also use your gloved hand to make sure the resin has spread completely over everywhere that you want it to go. But I like to go around my piece and look and get down at eye level to make sure I haven't missed a spot, because that is one of the most annoying things if you've ever flood coated, top coated a piece, to find that there's a little gap where that resin just didn't go, and then having to repeat the whole process again just to fix that one little area where that resin didn't go before it did cure. Now with this, I always use a blowtorch to pop any of my bubbles over a heat gun, because a blowtorch is a lot hotter, it's more effective at popping the bubbles, and it's also not going to blow the resin off my piece. I will always torch my piece multiple times throughout this top coating process, so I like to do it within the first 5 minutes of applying my top coat to just pop those initial bubbles. I then wait another 10 minutes to go back in and repeat. When I do add heat, I am really quick. I do not hold it in one spot, and I do not do it for a very long time. So about 10-15 seconds, a quick burst of heat, and then take the torch off to then wait another 10 minutes and go back in. And then right before it does start to cure, I will go back in once again, normally around the 20-minute mark, for the final torching. And it's all very quick, because you can overdo it and end up burning the resin. And I like to just place a clean plastic tub over the top to protect it from any bugs or any dirt or dust that might get in to the resin while it is setting. For this piece, I'm just going to be top coating and not flood coating. So top coating is where you just apply resin to that top surface area, and I'm just going to be bringing it just right up to the edge, but not have it pour over the edge. I want to get the resin to dome. So I'm just applying enough resin and then very carefully using my paddle pop stick or any tool that you find is helpful to bring it right up to the edge and to get that resin to dome. I always add a little bit of resin at a time and keep just pulling it to the edge to see how much I need, so that way I can get a really beautiful dome and not break the surface tension by applying too much resin, where therefore it would start to pour over the edge. Now, if I do accidentally add too much resin and that surface tension breaks, so therefore a bit of the resin will start flowing over the edge, it's not a big deal because I have taped it up to protect all of my edges, and then once it is dry I can just pull that off. But ideally I'd like to apply a perfect amount of resin so that way I get a perfect flawless dome to my top coat piece. For the tea light candle holder and my ring cone, I can't level them beforehand because I can't place the leveler on them, but it's not a big deal because they are smaller pieces, and because of the curve and the shape to them, the resin will flow off really well naturally. I'm doing all of the exact same steps I did in the previous flood coat, so I'm just applying the resin all over using my paddle pop stick to make sure that resin fully coats the entire area, and then I'm just going to be adding heat 3 times throughout the process to pop any of those bubbles. And just really, it's really important to just double check that you have got every single part of that piece. So look underneath, look around, because sometimes it's so easy to miss the tiniest little gap, especially when your pieces do curve under. Take your time when applying the resin. I always let all my pieces set for at least 48 hours before I do touch them to make sure they have fully cured and hardened, but you can see how well that resin has gripped the sides of my pieces. The flood coat is flawless, and all I have to do now is just to remove the backing on all of the pieces. Now, you'll find sometimes it will just peel straight off and it won't be an issue. You won't have any resin stuck to any areas, just like I'm doing on my tea light candle holder that had the PVA glue. But if you do ever get some resin that's a little bit hard, a few of the drips have stuck a bit better, use a heat gun to heat up that resin. That will help soften it, and then it will be a lot easier to peel away. Now, if you have any more questions about how to top and flood coat your resin pieces, feel free to leave them in the comments below. And if you did get benefit out of this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to check out my playlist for more resin tutorials. Thank you for watching.